This was a rich conversation that we just heard from our electeds, and I'm so eager to be able to start this conversation with our next panel here. So I'd like to introduce Karen Chapple, the professor and director of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, and professor emerita at UC Berkeley. Jake Krimmel, an economist at the Federal Reserve Board. Shane Phillips, who manages the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative for the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and Nithya Raman, an urban planner, now politician, serving as the Los Angeles City Council member for the 4th District since 2020. So thank you all for being here. Hi. Hello. So just to help frame the conversation here, and it has been a rich conversation all day long, starting with Vicky's panel and hearing from Vincent. Obviously in California, changes to the state's regional needs housing assessment has led to a significant increase in the number of units the city needs to plan for, including for low-income households, but clearly there are some challenges there that have been spoken to. What's more, we have local communities, especially historically marginalized BIPOC neighborhoods, that have raised legitimate concerns about gentrification and displacement. So what's more, we've got these hot markets in LA and San Francisco that really shows that a simplistic supply-side housing policy is not going to address the local affordability crisis, and in fact, it might make it actually worse. So the goal of this conversation this afternoon is to sort of explore these issues and discuss what the research has shown that links between the zoning policies and affordability, and highlight the policy issues that local and state policymakers, like we just heard, need to keep in mind when we're seeking to expand affordability. So to start our conversation, you've all been in the fields doing your individual work, is to ask each of you to sort of help us set up this conversation a bit further, and then we'll open it up for a panel conversation. I will remind the audience that there are index cards, so we would love to have your questions, so I invite you to do that along the way. So Karen, if I can start with you here. You have long studied the issue of gentrification and displacement, and now have a new study that looks at the evidence for how housing market supply interventions influence displacement. Can you tell us a little bit about why these dynamics are so hard to measure and what you found?
Sure, thanks so much. So the displacement debate in research is far from resolved, and certainly among the public is far from resolved. Part of the issue is that researchers have really struggled to measure displacement. So we don't know when people move, we don't really know if it's voluntary or involuntary unless we go and ask them. We don't know from our census data what individuals are doing because it's aggregate. When we look at eviction data, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg because most forced moves come from harassment, whether it's subtle or blatant. So the question is, how should we track displacement and exclusion, the ability to move into neighborhoods? So Jackie Wong at Stanford and I, in our study, we used 2 individual level proprietary data sets. One was the Consumer Credit Panel, and the other was Data Axle, Infogroup data. And then we cross-validated them to make sure, because we didn't really trust either data set. And then we threw out the results that didn't correspond between the 2 data sets, but actually most did. I just want to mention one other thing on the measurement challenge. Supply. Measuring housing production impacts in California is really hard when nobody's built any housing. And particularly when we want to understand long-term displacement impacts, we want to go back 10 years, and we look back 10 years and nothing was being built in our cities. So we can't really study it. But that said, we did our study, and it was sort of a good news, bad news story about displacement and exclusion. And Vicky Bean has already covered a little bit of the good news. So the good news, when a new building is built, say a building of 100 units, impacts on mobility are very, very small. So there will be an increased probability of a household of moving out of about 10%, more or less. And good news, you have more people moving in to the neighborhood than you have moving out. And those in-migration impacts hold even for low-income households, even though it's less than for affluent households. You don't see impacts on forced displacement or out-migration unless you build more than 100 units. So that means that missing middle type interventions are not causing displacement. And building overcomes exclusion. So this is all the good news. Now the bad news. There's still displacement. There's displacement of a handful of families when we build new housing of 100 units or more. So there are justice issues there. Secondly, there's tremendous variation by market type and neighborhood type. So when you build, you may mitigate displacement and exclusion in your cooler markets. And most recently, we've been comparing Los Angeles and San Francisco, and we found, particularly in Los Angeles, you're having those mitigation effects, but not so much in San Francisco, and not so much in Los Angeles' hot markets or more affluent markets. In those types of places, you may see increases in out-migration. You might not even be able to open up more affluent places. Thirdly, the negative impact might be that the in-migration decreases over time. So those great effects of opening up neighborhoods tend to decay unless you can keep building and building. So new supply is not the panacea for stabilizing neighborhoods. There's so much demand. There's suppressed household formation, there's overcrowding, there's rent-burdened households. So we can't build our way out of the affordability problem, at least not in these affluent, hot markets, and maybe not for lower income households. So if you want to have opportunity, you want to have people moving to high opportunity affluent areas, if you want low income people to live in the core near where all the jobs are, you're going to need other solutions in addition to new supply.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of a great transition to talk to Jake, because there, as Karen is saying, there's clearly a need for production of affordable housing, but it is not a panacea, especially in these hot markets. But in this era of limited public subsidies, many cities are looking to policies towards inclusionary zoning to boost affordability as part of the market rate projects. So can you tell us a little bit about what Seattle's done with its mandatory housing affordability program, and what you and Betty Wang learned about its impact so far?
Sure. Well, thanks so much to the Turner Center for inviting me here. And as an employee of the Federal Reserve, I have to say, everything I say here are my views and Betty's views, not those of the Fed or the US government. Our study about Seattle, it's kind of all about balance. And I guess this is a nice panel to be thinking about how to expand affordability, especially for affordable or subsidized inclusionary zoning housing through liberalizing land use and zoning. So these are two typical policy levers that you might think are in conflict with one another. On one hand, you want to have developers build units that are below market rate, but also you want to sort of you don't want sort of to kneecap the policies themselves. So what Seattle did, like many cities, sort of facing two simultaneous related crises: one, just a general housing shortage, and two, an affordability crisis, more acute at sort of the lower end of the income distribution. So what Seattle did was to basically upzone nearly every neighborhood that had multifamily housing between 2017 and 2019. And what upzoning is, it allows for more density, more units to be built on any given plot. But if a developer wanted to build on these newly upzoned plots, they had to include a certain number of affordable units under this inclusionary zoning mandate, or to pay into some sort of citywide fund for affordability. So we called this in our paper upzoning with strings attached. So there's this upzone, this benefit to the developers, but there's these strings attached to make sure that there's some affordable units reserved. Right, so basically what did we find when you have two policies that are thought of as traditionally in conflict with one another? Not surprisingly, we found some mixed results, as you kind of tend to with economics research, right? The great news is that this didn't stifle development writ large, right? There was some take-up going on. These were neighborhoods that were already quite in demand. So it was very clear that this affordability mandate did not stifle development. What it did do overall, though, was sort of change exactly where developers were siting their new projects. And what we found, especially for sort of smaller projects, I think that some earlier panels were talking about, the difference between a larger project and a smaller project. You get the really nice economies of scale with larger multifamily developments. But when you have a smaller multifamily development, such as a duplex or a triplex, and you have this affordability mandate, that ends up being really detrimental for a project to pencil for developers. And so what developers did was they basically strategically sited their new projects just outside of this newly upzoned area. And so they were basically siting projects still in the same neighborhood overall, but on parcels that were not subject to this new sort of reform, right? And so we called it, strategic avoidance of that sort of thing. And what we learned overall from this project is that, harkening back to something that folks in the last panel were speaking about was, the law of unintended consequences is basically undefeated, right? So we can think a lot about policies that are designed with really good intentions, but how might private actors sort of try to avoid or get around the intentions of the policy, and are we okay with those outcomes? We think at the end we are okay with that for right now, and that's both because housing is still being built overall. Some of that is below market rate, and the second big reason, and I think we'll talk about this later, was sort of like building institutional capital and state capacity and coalitions. A reform that's as ambitious as this, that has sort of two competing arms, the only way that gets passed is if you bring a lot of people to the table. And as they did in Seattle, they brought developers to the table. They brought sort of the YIMBY groups to the table. They brought affordable housing advocates to the table, and they brought people who were really concerned about gentrification and displacement also to the table. And they said, what can we sort of like agree upon? A great compromise is one where no one's happy. But that sort of, having passed this law that's still in effect, in conversations with folks in Seattle we've spoken to, they've said this has allowed us, even though it wasn't a resounding success in the 3 or 4 years right now, it's going to allow us to come back to the negotiating table and move forward on affordable housing goals that both expand and liberalize zoning and land use, but also keep in mind the other concerns about displacement and about more affordable housing as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. So bringing it back to Los Angeles, Shane, I know you've looked at transit-oriented communities program, which was one effort to expand affordability here in LA to meet its production numbers. Can you tell us a little bit about the program, its successes, but also why it may not necessarily be the solution to increasing rental affordability more broadly?
Sure. So the TOC program, Transit-Oriented Communities, is a density bonus program. And just to tie it to this a little bit, the Seattle program was like a slight upzoning with mandates attached.
Right.
Density bonuses are generally voluntary. The upside to that approach is if you really screw up the policy and no one wants to use it, you're still at baseline. You haven't made things worse. With mandates, you can get in that situation. Didn't happen in Seattle, fortunately.
But it could have, if you don't have places zone capacity nearby, then you might have really been in trouble.
Right.
So that's maybe the California case.
Right. And so the TOC program is sort of a super density bonus for folks familiar with the state density bonus program, which has been around for decades. That used to allow up to a 35% increase in dwelling unit density on a parcel, now up to 50% in exchange for below market units. The TOC program also allows floor area bonuses, height bonuses, parking reductions, lots of things like that. And so it was adopted in late 2017, and since that time, about 50,000 units have been proposed, probably 30 to 35-ish thousand have been permitted. Maybe a quarter of those are below market. Pretty much all affordable housing subsidized developers use the TOC program at this point. Another really cool aspect of it, which actually reduces the number and share of units that are affordable, but is perhaps worth it, is it has a category for extremely low income housing, which is 30% of area median income. Subsidized developers generally do not produce this except in the context of supportive housing for formerly unhoused people. And so it's structured in such a way where private developers, unsubsidized developers, are really incentivized to take that route. And so we've produced 1,000, 2,000, quite a few of these extremely low-income units over the past 5 or so years. One, I think, more overlooked benefit that myself and my colleagues Mike Manville, Paavo Monkkonen, and Nolan Gray worked on is the approval process. So the TOC program made it a lot more projects able to go through the by right process. And we found that the by right TOC projects were approved kind of from application to receiving their building permit about 30% faster than the average non-TOC discretionary project. So this, I think that works out to 100-ish days, maybe more. So that was a really big benefit. And even the discretionary TOC projects were faster than discretionary non-TOC, I think in part because that program is more narrow in what you can do. It doesn't allow for as many kind of off-menu requests and these kinds of things. In terms of the trade-offs or why this may not be the solution long-term, and I want to emphasize that, I think in the short term, it's pretty unquestionable that the TOC program has been a really big success, in part because of that density bonus structure. I think it has just led to more market rate and affordable housing production. And it's transit-oriented, so the whole idea here is it's all within half a mile of good to high-quality bus or train service. But some limitations here. It's a density bonus, so it only applies to whatever the density is in the existing zoning. So if you have a single-family neighborhood, it just doesn't do anything at all. They're completely untouched by this program. Another drawback here is there were really no displacement protections in the program. And that is still the case. Some state laws have kind of covered for a little bit of that. I will say, if the Senator Scott Wiener is here, SB 50 would have addressed both of these issues if it had passed, but unfortunately did not. Another issue that I think is a little more abstract, but still really important, is that if we consider TOC to be, and density bonuses generally, to be sort of a subset of inclusionary zoning, like other forms of inclusionary zoning, it's not the opposite of exclusionary zoning. It really depends on exclusionary zoning being maintained to function because it relies on high land values that the exclusionary zoning maintains and props up. And so when people say, in defense of these kinds of programs, which I think is entirely true, that the cost does not actually come in the form of higher rents, because you can't charge more than market rate. That's kind of the definition of market rate. It comes out of the cost of the land that the developer pays for when they buy the property before developing. But again, we have to have a policy in place of exclusionary zoning to limit the amount of land available so that the prices are high, so there is something to take away and still have the landowner want to sell. So there's a kind of a long-term problem here where if we actually want to lower land costs so that we can lower the cost of housing and development, we're going to have to address that issue. And I think as long as we are relying on kind of limiting where you can build multifamily housing and having high land values so we can kind of ask for something in return, we're going to be limited in what we can achieve.
I want to bring Nithya into this conversation because you get this on-the-ground experience here talking, just to jump off of what Shane is saying. And it'd be great to hear your perspective in terms of the political dynamics between zoning reforms and then producing affordable housing. And what's the right balance, right, between the power between the city council and the community and getting that community voice and input into the process, and how do we sort of advance these land use reforms at the local level?
You know, one of the things that I've really tried to do in my work on the city council has been to talk about housing production. I talk about housing production all the time. In almost every community meeting, I talk about the need for more housing. I'm constantly talking about the limitations of our current system of building housing in the city of Los Angeles, and I've really tried to bring that conversation to my work now as the chair of the Housing and Homelessness Committee at the city council. But one of the things that I really try and do when I'm working on this issue is to try and ensure that we're not putting two goals against one another. So if we have a city that has historically had high rates of gentrification and displacement, even if we can't really measure it, it feels like it. And if we have a city that has seen new construction that looks very expensive and feels very exclusionary to many of the people in it, I think we can also have a city that steps up and says, we're going to fight back against displacement, and we're going to make sure that we're protecting tenants. And so one of the things that I've really tried to do in my work in city council is to say we can build more housing and we can keep people where they are. We can build more housing and still protect communities. We can build more housing and build our city's capacity to protect tenants who are in need of support. And that's, I think if you can do those two things at the same time, that you can build a great deal more trust in government to be able to move the entire project of improving our city forward. And one of the things that I think has been really interesting to me is in talking about inclusionary zoning as a policy, I sometimes feel like the reason why inclusionary zoning comes up is because we're not willing to do the work of improving our city's capacity to protect tenants enough. Inclusionary zoning, I think, is a great policy where it works. We just recently had a study that the housing department presented to us, housing and planning department in the committee, where they looked at our city's capacity to build housing if we had an inclusionary requirement. And what we found was that if you had an 11% inclusionary requirement for new construction, that would produce more housing only in the very highest resource neighborhoods of the city, really only on the west side and in mid-city. And everywhere else, it would actually disincentivize the production of new housing, right? And so, you know, you go out to communities and you say, you know, we need to build more housing, and they feel alienated from that. But I think you can talk to them and say, we need to build more housing and we need to protect communities, and here's exactly how we're going to protect communities. Here's all the resources that the city is going to put at your disposal to be able to make sure that you, a renter in this neighborhood, can stay in your home. And I think that opens up the conversation around housing in a really powerful way. And as a city council person here in LA, I feel like I'm really capable of having that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Karen and Jake, I noticed that you were both adamantly shaking your heads. I don't know if you want to add to that here.
You can go first.
Oh, sure. I mean, I was just thinking, I wish you were my council member.
Oh,
wow. So, I mean, because we've been hearing this all day, like we have to have a both-and approach.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely true. We have to do both, and that's the only way that both are going to work.
It's the only way.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this was exactly conversations that we had with both people in Seattle and also in our, you know, wonky data sets that we're actually like verifying, you know, the hypotheses that people are saying, which is, you know, IZ, if it's mandatory or not, tends to, at least I can speak from, you know, our setting, work exactly in the same situation that you're talking about. So, you know, the wealthier neighborhoods, it can work there. But if we're relying on, you know, the private sector primarily to build our homes, I think the unfortunate, or the reality, won't say whether it's fortunate or not, is that projects have to pencil. And so I think that needs to be kept in mind. And this is sort of exactly with the both and thing. Like if we're talking about density bonuses with IZ, those bonuses have to be enough. And it seems to me that developers want to build. They certainly are frustrated when they feel like they cannot. So I'm going to take them at their word on that. And it seems to me that if bonuses are large enough, and in certain places in Seattle, the upzonings were large enough that they did. In certain places they weren't, so they washed their hands of those parcels or something like that. But this is sort of exactly what we're seeing in our data as well. So it's nice confirmation.
If I can also
please.
jump in really quick. So I think I'm sort of here to be an IZ critic a little bit today, but that's like not my whole thing. I wrote a whole book basically on what the council member is talking about, like really tying these two things together and how the idea of protecting tenants and housing supply does not need to be in tension. There are tensions, but there are also many ways we can find to make these work together. I think, interestingly, I've gotten more supportive of rent stabilization, eviction protections, these kinds of things over time, and actually less of IZ specifically. But I think part of why inclusionary zoning, density bonuses, mandates, whatever, are so popular is because I think what we really need to do is just spend a lot of money on subsidized housing, whether through vouchers or direct, subsidies for construction. But cities just don't have the resources to do that at scale. And until state and federal governments step in to fill that gap, they are really limited in what they can do, and they feel like they have to deliver, not just housing supply, but affordable housing supply for their constituents. So I understand where it comes from.
So I kind of want to flip it back to you all, especially, Jake and Shane here, just given the work that you did in Seattle and then also with the TOC, is like, how did those findings then inform what cities should be considering when we're thinking about density reforms?
You want to take this one?
I guess I can talk about the zoning buffer and brought up zoning stuff a little bit. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot is how I think a lot of people in this room are probably familiar with, it's a weird statement to make, but Greg Morrow's dissertation, specifically the chart showing how in 1960 the city of LA had capacity.
I think everyone just fell asleep.
I actually thought this was the opposite. Like this was the only room where everyone wouldn't immediately fall asleep. I was like, oh yeah, Greg Morrow's dissertation.
But there's a chart that shows in 1960 the city of LA had capacity, estimated capacity based on zoning and development standards and everything, of about 10 million people. At the time, our population was about 2.5 million, so we had 4 times as much capacity as population. Over the next 20 years, we downzoned so that our capacity fell to about 3.5 million and our population rose to 3 million. And we've kind of been just like inching both up over the next 30, 40 years. New York did the same thing in 1961 with the zoning code update where they went from capacity for 55 million people to capacity for 12 million people. They just massively downzoned all in one fell swoop. And I think there's really a connection here where we are all aware that a shortage of housing contributes to high costs. It comes down to scarcity. And I think the same is true with land. When you have a very small share of land where multifamily housing is available, where it can be built, it's going to be very expensive. And you're actually going to be very reliant on a pretty small number of landowners who are, have their own idiosyncratic interests and maybe just don't want to sell ever or see that the price is going up 5% a year and they don't need the money right now, so might as well just hold on to it, especially in California with Prop 13 where they're paying no money, nothing on taxes. So my hope is that we can kind of get back in that direction, not just have higher capacity, but really spread it around. So it's not just concentrated in a few areas where not only is that going to lead to really dramatic change in those locations, but also the land prices are going to kind of escalate as capacity grows. And if we can spread this around, so maybe half or more of parcels, and I realize this is a very ambitious dream, but half or more of residential parcels allow at least a 10 or 12 or 15 unit apartment or condo building, suddenly no one has the leverage to really command a premium for that land. And I think not only do you just have a lot more capacity, but prices can come down for that reason. And when prices come down, you can actually build more because the market for those homes is larger. There's just a lot of downstream benefits. And so getting there is really where I hope to go. And just thinking about future research, there's been a little bit on Auckland's upzoning, which is probably the best example of this. They did in 2016 upzoned about 75% of their land. Didn't really see a lot of land price increases, except in kind of specific circumstances. I think ADU legalization in California is actually an interesting version of this as well, where I don't think we really saw a whole bunch of land price increases because of that. Again, because when everyone can build an ADU, like why pay a premium for any particular parcel where you want to do that? So that's kind of one thing I really would like to see.
Yeah.
One very large thing.
Well, I think you nailed it. But to sort of just put a bow on it, if you contrast like an Auckland-style upzoning to something that we would do in the U.S., based on what tends to happen is that we don't touch very much of the single-family zone land, which in these cities, which is anywhere between 70 to 80% of the land, or maybe more. So we're really, if we're only, fiddling with the margins on 20% of the land, it's fighting with at least one hand tied behind our back. I realize politically, and maybe we can get into a conversation about political feasibility and what it takes to build that sort of environment and that coalition. But I think we know why that's happening in the U.S. right now, right? They're not touching very much single-family only land, with the exception of the ADU stuff. But as far as massive upzonings go, it's really just on stuff that's already zoned for multi, which is not that much land.
And I think part of why we've been able to build a lot of ADUs is you don't have to tear down the existing structure to do that. It's almost free land in a way.
Yeah.
Once we get into the scale where it actually requires tearing down homes, SB 9, I think it's a great step forward, but it's very rarely going to make sense to tear down a home just to build 4, especially I think when land prices are so high. It's going to be 8, 10, 12 units that is going to be required to justify tearing something down, unless it's on its last legs anyway.
So Shane, I want to throw a little wrench into the Auckland example. So you upzone. So upzoning is a windfall for landowners. So everybody has the potential of making more money. So you do a blanket upzoning, and whether you're doing a selective upzoning or a blanket upzoning, developers are going to go where they can make money. Mm-hmm. Homeowners are going to build ADUs where they can make it pencil, right? So, and then this is most likely then to happen in the most affluent areas or the hottest markets where people can make the most money, right? So I think there's a potential here that I think people have been sort of jumping on the blanket upzoning as solving a problem when actually developers and windfall profits are the actual demon we should go after. And just one other point on the ADU thing is that I think we haven't really seen the land value increase with ADUs because of Prop 13, because nobody sells their home, and so people are sitting on all that money and they haven't been reassessed. And that we'll see it in the long run, that those folks that have been building ADUs see this big jump up in property value.
I will say, on windfalls, the whole, really the main idea I'm thinking of here is the blanket upzoning should not result in windfalls. I think in the very most valuable, highest priority areas, it still will to some extent. But this is really the idea. I can't say at this point whether it's true or not, though, and this is why I think it's a really important area for research, because it's a genuine concern that a lot of people have, that we don't want to. One example with ADUs in particular is there's a concern that, well, now you're allowing these ADUs, which is great, it's increasing supply, ADUs tend to be pretty affordable, but if it increases the value of all homes, all single-family homes, you're also kind of restricting homeownership opportunities, increasing the cost of those homes for people who might just want to live in the single-family home. And maybe that's a trade we're willing to make, but it is a genuine concern that people have, and I think if we found that this blanket upzoning maybe doesn't have much of an impact on the prices in that way, then we can kind of put that aside and move forward.
Yeah, well, I would love to bring Nithya's perspective into all of this because, I mean, as you think about this, and this is a very big question, so take a stab at it if you will. But like, what in terms of when you're thinking about talking to developers and thinking about like what is the right mix of carrot and stick so that we can incentivize correctly with trying to avoid some of these unintended consequences. Very difficult to do, but how do you think about it as a decision maker?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, and I feel like in this role, I spend a lot of my time thinking about what will be the thing that I can do that'll have the greatest impact that we can implement most quickly, and that we can get the greatest buy-in for. And I feel like the thing that I've been thinking about a lot more recently has really been around the city's capacity to step up to what it's saying it will do in a lot of these discussions. One thing that I really want to think about is our capacity to actually be able to process applications more quickly. And I know that seems like a very small thing, but I actually think it's a really big thing that a city can do better, and particularly the city of Los Angeles, where it takes so long for applications to get processed. And so even as we're having conversations around density bonuses and around SB 9 and the impacts of all these programs, if it takes more than a year to go through our various departmental processes, I think we're not going to see the impacts of those changes very quickly at all. And so for me at this moment, I know this isn't really what you asked, but for me in this moment, this is what I feel like is the most fruitful conversation to be having in this role, which is how can we maximize everything that we already have at our disposal in terms of the laws on increasing housing capacity, the state laws, and how can we ensure that Los Angeles is doing everything in its power to deliver on the promises of those new laws? And what is it that we're doing, whether it be DWP coming in a year and a half after you've already started the project and telling you that you need to pay an additional $2 million and take another year to do something? Can we prevent that from happening to a project? How can we make sure that we're doing everything in our power to actually deliver on the potential of these laws, I think is what I feel like the city needs to be doing right now.
Yeah. So just as a reminder, we are going to be collecting questions. So again, I invite you to write them down. But you know, we touched on this a little bit earlier about tenant protections and sort of taking like a yes and approach here. So Karen, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the lessons that you draw from your research in terms of like how zoning reforms need to be coupled with tenant protections.
Sure. So our work on tenant protections is quite mixed. One of the findings that we should have known we were going to get, but was that rent stabilization is exclusionary, and economists had told us this for years. But it's harder for people to move in, and so when the implications of this is that. You know, when we're upzoning, you know, and when we're starting to build in these kind of affluent areas or these hot market places, you know, we actually need to build more in these places that have the tenant protections in place. Great, you got the tenant protections, Berkeley. Okay, you know now you're ready. You're set to go and build more. And so that there's the playing field is in place there. But conversely, what about these neighborhoods where you don't have tenant protections? What about cities that don't have just cause eviction ordinances, or don't have rent control, or who don't have even decent housing preservation ordinances and resources in place? You're going to need to put all that in place before you build in order to make sure that you don't have those displacement impacts.
Mm-hmm. One thing that has come up in our conversation throughout the day and would like to bring into the panel is, the issue of homelessness, especially in cities like Los Angeles. And, oftentimes it seems that there is sort of, that the research on zoning reform doesn't incorporate that element. So I don't know, Shane, if you want to take this or not, or open it up to everyone, is like, why is there this gap between housing and homelessness studies, and like where do you think the important connections are, and especially Nithya, like as you're thinking as a policymaker, how to tether these two things?
I think one of the interesting things again about this role is that in the city of Los Angeles we have a legislative role as a council person, so we make laws around the city, but there's also a huge number of executive functions that our offices serve. And so one of the things that we do in our district is really try and create a system that can respond to homelessness in my district. And I see the impacts of the lack of supply of housing on our capacity to respond to homelessness effectively every single day. So we get vouchers from the federal government that we can use to take people who are living in our interim housing sites and who are living on our city streets and be able to move them into permanent homes, into homes where they can utilize these vouchers and get much or all of their rent paid. And in Los Angeles, that process of being able to match a voucher to a housing unit is so challenging that we end up having to get extensions on those vouchers in order to be able to find the matches. And we are now thinking about finding ways to bring more control over supply, like through master leasing programs, like renting an entire building or buying buildings, just so that we are able to utilize our vouchers. So to me, on a very practical level, that connection between the lack of housing availability in our market and my capacity as a council person to resolve homelessness in my district is so real and so potent. And again, what I'm able to do when I go out and talk to people is to tell people about that. And I think intuitively for people that makes sense. And so when you go out there and talk about that, I think you are building the case for more supply. You're telling people, if we had more units, I'd be able to match more people with these vouchers. I'd be able to utilize the tools that we have as a city much more effectively to get people off the streets. And that is something that really makes sense to people. And the other way that I talk about housing costs and homelessness and that connection, and I think that really makes sense for a lot of people, is that if you are in a home now, and you, versus if you were in a home 15 years ago or 20 years ago when Los Angeles was cheaper, if you lost your home, you'd probably find another home with the same, at the same price point. And today, that is virtually impossible. And so if you lose your home, your current home is probably the cheapest home that's going to be available to you. And again, when you go out there and talk to people about that, that makes sense. And increasing supply and its connection to homelessness makes so much more sense when you're able to talk exactly about what it means for people who are facing this market and the choices that they have in front of them. And I think the more that we're able to make those connections to people, the more that we're able to build support for not just building homeless housing, but housing overall that can address these issues.
Yeah,
If
please.
I can add, I feel like homelessness as sort of a sector or a field in research and in practice, it does feel very separate. And, it's very service focused, it's complicated with the coordinated entry system, things like that. Like, I am much more of a housing person than a homelessness person, but I think a lot of people, myself included, are really increasingly appreciating the connection between these two things. I think the Hilton Foundation is a really great example of that. I should, give them credit as they're funding some of our work right now at the Lewis Center, specifically thinking about this sort of the upstream determinants of homelessness, not just once someone has become homeless, but like what are the things that are leading people there. And, like drawing that connection more clearly. When Madi was up here, I remember talking to one of his former colleagues, Greg Spiegel, years ago at Inner City Law Center, how their mission is to end homelessness. And I asked them, why are you kind of getting interested in housing policy, land use policy, supply, these kinds of things? And he said, well, if our mission is to end homelessness, we've just come to recognize that it will not happen if we don't address these other housing policy and land use policy issues. And so we have to engage on it, and they have been for years now. But I think more and more people are appreciating that and not seeing homelessness or unhoused people as like this fixed population, that if we just help them, everything will be fine, because all of these other systems that are in place are causing new people all the time to become homeless, and people who, if they lived in another city, probably would never become homeless, but because of prices and because of other things happening here, they are much more likely to.
Jake, to kind of bring you back in, and you talked about this at the top of the conversation about political feasibility, right? And I think that's a thread in everyone's work here on stage, but policymakers are clearly have their work cut out with them in terms of boosting supply and lowering housing costs, but finding the right suite of reforms that are politically feasible in the short run is like nothing short of difficult. So how should we
solve that?
Yeah, right. So right, please, if you could, in like 2 minutes.
Well, I mean, I hope this isn't too much of a cop-out answer, but I think what sort of Nithya was saying reminded me of the fact that, state capacity and like doing something well and identifying one thing that you can do that will have a tangible systemic change to the process is really underrated and important, and that's more in our control as policymakers or policy adjacent people. Because, as someone who's a researcher, say you're looking at, the carrots and sticks of whatever reform and density bonus versus affordability, and either the researcher or the developer is all making these calculations based on, taking sort of the world as given of how the regulatory environment and the process works. If that process and regulatory environment can change and be improved, all of a sudden, many more things pencil, for lack of a better term. And that's sort of like an everybody wins efficiency gain. So I think that's a great sort of jumping off point. And then once you have, I think, build confidence in state capacity from sort of the voters' point of view, things, I imagine, look a lot different. And maybe people change their mind about, oh, this actually does work. We see tangible improvements. Obviously, one of the biggest things we're up against as people trying to expand affordability through zoning reforms is that things can take a while. As Senator Wiener was saying before, it's not going to turn around in 5 years. But if we get more efficient and many more things start to pencil, maybe you get some greater economies of scale there, and then instead of 5 or 15 years, you're looking at, wow, 20 years, it actually does look significantly better. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe what was going to be 20 is actually looking better in 10, is what I was trying to say. So yeah, maybe that's the optimistic view. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on state capacity from the state.
I want to just say that I think what we're talking about is trust.
Yes.
And I love that word, and because I think you can think about it system-wide, but you can also think about it just in the context of your own neighborhood. And I think when you're building, for example, a new building, when a new building comes up, because the city's not usually building anything, but when a new building comes up in your neighborhood, and there's supposed to be 15% of the units that are saved for people that are lower income, one of the things I hear over and over again is who's actually living in that building, and if you can just show people that yes, indeed, those are affordable units, and that there's an application process, and yes, the city is certifying regularly that those are low-income residents, that builds trust. If you open up a homeless shelter in your neighborhood, and you can take people who are on those streets in that neighborhood and take them off the streets and bring them into those shelters, you can show people that yes, opening up a shelter works. It doesn't have to happen at a system-wide level. It can happen at your neighborhood and build trust. And in a district like mine, District 4, which is the third wealthiest district in the city, it's also one of the highest number of registered voters in the city. It voted more for the mayor during this last election than some of the districts that were undergoing city council elections. You know, it is a district that turns out. And so if you can build trust in District 4 for a better system, that means you're building a Los Angeles that has trust in a better system. And so to me, it feels like you can do it here, and you can make a big impact across the entire city.
I mean, I want to ask the questions in a slightly different way to Shane and Karen, and then we can go to audience questions here is, you know, from what can researchers do to sort of identify the work that potentially needs to be done that might be politically feasible, right? That we might have these solutions that can actually work out.
Well, researchers need to do a much better job with knowledge mobilization and getting ideas out the door. And Shane's actually done a great job with this, with the book and all that. But we can do, you know, there's a number of different tools we should be using. And, you know, I think also we need to kind of leverage the movement in California. We need to acknowledge how far we've come in our politics in California. Just think about this term pro-housing. You know, this is like dinner table conversation now, and I think somebody in this room invented it when he was at HCD 10 years ago, and it's working. It really helps. I just wish it was pro-housing and pro-people, or pro-tenant, and then we'd have the both and. And you know, so there's also been, you know, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative has funded my work, brought, and others. The Case Made has helped, Lightbox Collaborative, a number of different communications groups are working on the housing issue and giving us the language to talk about it. So for instance, you know, we need to think about housing as a system, not as a separate set of silos. So this is the affordable housing, and this is the workforce housing, and this is the affluent luxury housing. No, I mean, this is a system, just like we have a transit system. They're all connected, they're all part of each other, and we're all in this together. So these types of things we need to adopt, and as researchers need to make sure that we are using those terms as well.
Yeah, I think the knowledge mobilization is super important, and thank you for the perfect tee up to mention our podcast, UCLA Housing Voice, where we talk about housing research every 2 weeks. We have 55 episodes, so easy to find and lots to listen to. I would say right now we're probably doing a better job of featuring other people's research than our own. We're working on that, and you know, if anyone wants to send us some funding to actually, you know, pay for all of this, that would be great too. But, you know, I think beyond, I mean, that is so important. I think a lot of researchers really think like, I'm just gonna do good work and it's gonna speak for itself, you know, and I don't have to worry about it once it's published. And it's just not true. I wish it was true. I really don't like, you know, reaching out to a bunch of people every time something's written, but it's so important. And just, you know, staying in contact with people. Beyond that though, I think there's also a balance here where not everyone needs to be the researcher who is thinking about like what's politically realistic. Like we need the dreamers and the people who are proposing things that seem impossible right now. But we need that, we just need both. And I think individual people can actually be both of those and really think about things in both terms, and especially and just be very vocal about both kinds. And I think that's further along than we are. And so let's get there and we'll worry about the rest later.
Yeah, and if I can add to that is, I think one theme that I've heard throughout just in conversations one-on-one is the importance of storytelling and building a narrative that puts a human face to all of this so that people really understand what it is that we're talking about. Because I think a point that's been made over and over again is these are kitchen table issues now. Everyone is touched by this and everyone is thinking about it. So hopefully I will get these questions from our sharp audience members down rightly. But this question sort of speaks to the best practices of how much excess zone capacity an area should have. X times population, vary geographically or by some other standard. So what do you all think in terms of best practices, what that should look like?
I don't think there's good research on this. I would say, though, that, I think there's a big difference between having 3 times the capacity of your current population concentrated in 10% of the land versus 50% or more of the land. So I think that distribution really is important. I think at the same time, you don't want to have something where, say, like what Minneapolis did, where you eliminate single-family zoning, you allow 3 units on every parcel, and yet, for one, 3 is just not enough, again, to justify redevelopment in many cases, and even worse, they didn't actually allow like larger buildings. So you have to build a 3-unit building that's the same size and has the same setbacks and everything as a single unit. So I think the details just really matter. But I think distribution and like really large numbers, I mean, I do think the capacity has to be at least 2, 3, 4 times more than the current population. Otherwise, it's going to be quite concentrated because in most cases, if something's getting built, it's probably about 10 times more units or more than what was there before. And it doesn't take much land at that kind of density multiple before you're at double your capacity.
I would just, in 2 seconds, push for more density in the downtowns and near transit. I think we haven't talked very much about transit and green stuff at all. That's the next conference should probably be.
But not just on corridors. I think just on corridors is a real problem for equity and pollution, and it's just very limiting in terms of, we're looking at doing things like that in, I think, the Wilshire corridor, where on that corridor, we're going to allow, 20, 30, 50-story buildings, and then half a block away are a bunch of single-family homes, and those are going to be untouched. I know you agree.
Yeah, I think another best practice would be, I see Ann Sewell here from our housing department. And I recently, Ann is our general manager, fabulous resource and brilliant. But she told me that the housing department doesn't have a dedicated comms team. And I think having investment in the work of city departments like the housing department, but also having investment in the capacity of the housing department to talk about the work that it's doing and to share about the resources that it has available, in addition to all of this, about like what is the specifics around what percentage of zoning and what percentage works or whatever. But we need to talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and we got to bring people into that discussion. So to me, that's like a baseline best practice that cities should get into as we're trying to do all this very tough stuff.
Oh, one last thing. I just think we have to be very positive too. Just like there is a lot to be gained from rebuilding and redeveloping and changing our neighborhoods, and like we need to tell that story more.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen, did you have anything on this? Or?
Let's go to the next question.
Last, all right, I think, all right, maybe you can start us off. So one of the questions is, how can you engage housing justice activists who have led on passing policy like JJJ and ULA in promoting some of these solutions?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm going to defer to you, but I do think.
I would defer to you.
So when we found that displacement impacts were minor, but they do exist, it became clear that there has to be mitigation, and then it became clear that mitigation, the specific form of that mitigation, is going to vary across the specific neighborhood context and market context. And so you can't have a one-size-fits-all, and that means that those organizers and those community groups need to be there up front, when we're putting the new transit line, when we're doing the new development, need to be getting the community together to think about, this is the building we want to save, it's got to be this one, or we need to build 17 ADUs here in order to keep people in place, whatever it is. So it has to have that local autonomy and specificity.
And often they know best.
Yes.
They've worked in the community, they have the tenants there, they know what to do. And so it feels like a lot of our work, the ULA coalition, for example, was driven by tenants groups. They were at the core of that work. And so I think for us to be able to, and tenant protections were included in the funding mechanisms of it. So that's what happens when you bring them to the table. It's not that just that you're funding more affordable housing. You're also funding the city's capacity to be able to protect tenants from displacement, and what a beautiful bill that is. And I think if you can bring them to the table right at the beginning, and they are, with our office, we're in constant communication with a range of groups, everyone from the apartment association to SAGE to local tenants unions, just to try and make sure that what we're doing makes sense for them and to them, and if it doesn't, for us to be able to change what we're doing and hopefully make it better. So it feels like it's just the core of what we need to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we'll squeeze in one last question here in the minute that we have. So TOC was created by a citizen who initiated the measure. The City Council has been debating an inclusionary zoning ordinance for years. What's better, zoning at the ballot box or zoning at the council? This actually sounds like a good question to end with. So speed round, maybe if you all have
You're
a thought.
TOC, so you're.
I mean, ballot box planning is very flawed. I have regularly said, though, that I do not think the TOC program would be as good as it is if it had to go through the city council. No offense. It was sort of like written by the planning department, approved by the planning commission, so it was sort of depoliticized in a way, and so there was a real benefit there. It's maybe kind of a good mix where there was a mandate that something had to be created, but there was still some leeway within the department where people are really experts, where they could figure out the details.
As a non-Californian, I think you guys have way too much to do with the ballot box anyway. So.
Well, I want to please join me in thanking our wonderful panel this afternoon.